On a freezing winter night in downtown Chicago, Nathan Caldwell stepped out of his black sedan after a late board meeting. 41 years old, a CEO worth millions, and completely alone. Then a voice came from behind him, weak shaking, barely a whisper. "Sir, I'm freezing." He turned. A woman stood under the streetlight, trembling so hard her knees were buckling. She didn't ask for money. She didn't tell a story. She just stood there, breaking apart in the cold. Nathan could have walked away like he always did, but instead he took off his coat and made a decision that neither of them could ever take back. The cold that night was the kind that didn't just touch skin. It crawled inside, settled into the bones, and stayed. Nathan had felt it the moment he stepped out of the car, but he was used to ignoring things that were uncomfortable. That was how he had built his life, 14 years running. Caldwell Technologies, a company he had grown from a small software startup into a corporation worth hundreds of millions. Board meetings, quarterly reports, investor calls. These were the things that filled his days. And at night, he went home to a penthouse apartment on Lakeshore Drive where no one was waiting. His driver, Marcus, had offered to pull the car around to the front entrance of the office building, but Nathan had told him to park across the street. He needed the air. He needed 60 seconds of something that wasn't a conference room. The divorce had been finalized 3 years ago, and his son Ethan, now 11, lived with his ex-wife in Connecticut. Nathan saw the boy once a month if the schedule allowed, which it rarely did. He told himself that the distance was temporary, that he would fix it when things slowed down. But things never slowed down, and somewhere along the way, he had stopped pretending they would. He was halfway across the parking lot when the voice reached him. It came from behind, thin and fractured like something that had already been broken before it left the mouth. Nathan turned and saw her standing under the pale cone of a street light. A woman, maybe early 30s, wearing a thin jacket that was never designed for a night like this. Her arms were wrapped around herself, and her whole body was shaking in a way that looked involuntary. Not the shiver of someone who was cold, but the tremor of someone whose body was beginning to shut down. Nathan's first instinct was the one that had kept him safe for 41 years' distance. Call someone. Let the system handle it. He reached for his phone, already thinking about dialing 911, already constructing the version of this moment where he did the reasonable thing and moved on. But then the woman's knees buckled. Not dramatically, not like a scene from a movie. She just folded slightly one hand, reaching for the lamppost to steady herself, and her eyes unfocused. Glassy met his for a second that lasted longer than it should have. She didn't say anything else. That was the part that got to him. No story, no explanation, no plea. Just that single sentence, still hanging in the frozen air between them. Nathan had met hundreds of people who wanted something from him. Investors, employees, journalists, his ex-wife's attorneys. Every one of them had a script. This woman had nothing. And somehow, that nothing cut through every wall he had spent years building. He pulled off his overcoat, a $1,500 cashmere piece he had bought in Milan last winter, and draped it over her shoulders without asking. The coat swallowed her. She was smaller than she had appeared from a distance, and up close he could see that her lips had gone a bluish gray. Her hands were chapped and swollen from the cold, and she was gripping the fabric of the coat like it was the only solid thing left in the world. "Can you walk?" Nathan asked. She gave a small nod, though her legs told a different story. He looked back at the sedan. Marcus was still inside, engine running, waiting. Nathan could put this woman in a cab. He could hand her $40 and the name of a shelter downtown. He could do any of the things that a reasonable, careful, reputation-conscious man in his position would do. Instead, he put his hand on her arm gently, the way you would guide someone who might fall, and walked her toward the car. He opened the back door and helped her in, then climbed in after her. Marcus glanced in the rearview mirror, but said nothing. He had worked for Nathan for 6 years, and had learned when to ask questions and when to drive. "Take us home," Nathan said. The words came out before he had fully decided to say them, and once they were out, he didn't take them back. The car pulled away from the curb and merged into the quiet, late-night traffic, and Nathan sat in the back seat, next to a woman he didn't know, heading to an apartment that hadn't had a guest in longer than he could remember. The woman, he didn't know her name, yet leaned against the window and closed her eyes. She was still trembling, but the heat from the car's vents was beginning to do its work. Nathan watched her from the corner of his eye and felt something shift inside his chest. Not attraction, not pity. Something older and more difficult to name. It was the feeling of recognizing a kind of exhaustion that had nothing to do with sleep. He had seen it before, in the mirror on the nights when even the penthouse felt like a cell. The look of someone who had run out of reasons to keep standing, but was still standing anyway. 20 minutes later, they arrived at his building. The doorman Greg opened the lobby entrance and registered the woman next to Nathan with a single professional glance. No reaction, no comment. Nathan guided her through the marble lobby into the private elevator and up 32 floors to his apartment. When the doors opened, the space stretched out in front of them, floor-to-ceiling windows, overlooking the lake, modern furniture that looked like it had never been touched, a kitchen where nothing had been cooked in weeks. It was the kind of home that magazines photographed, and it was exactly as empty as it looked. Nathan led her to the living room and gestured toward the couch. "Sit down. I'll get you something warm." She lowered herself onto the edge of the sofa, as if she wasn't sure she was allowed to touch it. He went to the kitchen, heated water, and brought back a cup of tea. When he set it on the table in front of her, her hands were still shaking as she reached for it. She wrapped both palms around the mug and held it close to her face, breathing in the steam. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Then, without looking up, she said, "My name is Claire." Her voice was steadier now, but still thin. "Claire Monroe." Nathan sat down in the chair across from her and nodded. "Nathan," he said. He didn't add his last name. He didn't mention the company, the title, or the building that bore his family's name on the 5th floor directory. In that moment in this room, those things didn't seem relevant. He was just a man who had brought a stranger home on a cold night, sitting across from a woman who looked like she had been cold for much longer than one evening. Claire slept on the couch that night. Nathan had offered the guest bedroom, but she shook her head and stayed where she was, still wrapped in his cashmere overcoat, the empty mug of tea resting on the table in front of her. He brought her a blanket and a pillow from the hallway closet, set them beside her without ceremony, and went to his own room at the other end of the apartment. He left his door open, not out of trust, but out of some instinct he couldn't explain, like a part of him needed to know she was still there when the sun came up. He barely slept. Every small sound from the living room, the creak of the couch, the rustle of fabric pulled him back to the surface. His mind kept circling the same questions. Who was she? What had brought her to that parking lot in the middle of winter, with nothing but a jacket that couldn't keep out a spring breeze? And underneath those questions, the one he didn't want to ask. What exactly had he done by bringing her here? Nathan Caldwell didn't act on impulse. He ran a company where every decision went through 3 layers of analysis before it reached his desk. But tonight he had put a stranger in his car, brought her to his home, and gone to bed like it was the most natural thing in the world. The disconnect between who he was and what he had done kept him staring at the ceiling until the first gray light appeared over the lake. When he walked into the living room at 6 in the morning, Claire was already awake. She was sitting upright on the couch, with the blanket folded neatly beside her and the pillow stacked on top, as if she was trying to erase any evidence that she had been there. The overcoat was draped over the armrest, also folded. She looked up when she heard his footsteps, and there was something guarded in her eyes, the look of someone calculating the fastest route to the nearest exit. "I should go," she said. Her voice was stronger than the night before. but it carried the same flatness, the same deliberate control. Nathan leaned against the kitchen counter and studied her for a moment. "Where?" he asked. Not confrontational, not demanding, just the question. Claire didn't answer right away. She looked down at her hands, which were no longer shaking, but still marked from the night before. The silence stretched between them, filling the apartment the way silence always did, in a space that was too large for one person. Nathan didn't push. He turned to the coffee machine, made 2 cups, and brought one to her. She took it, and he sat in the same chair across from her, where he had sat the night before. They drank in silence for several minutes, 2 strangers sharing a kitchen table's worth of distance, and nothing else. It was Claire who finally spoke. "You didn't have to do this." Her tone wasn't grateful, it was factual, almost clinical. She was stating a condition, not expressing an emotion. Nathan nodded. "I know." That was all. He didn't explain why he had done it, because he still wasn't sure himself. The quiet settled back in, but it was different this time. Less like a wall, more like a room that neither of them was ready to furnish. Nathan's phone buzzed on the counter, a 7 a.m. calendar reminder for a conference call with the Tokyo office. He glanced at it, silenced it, and set the phone face down. For the first time in years, the meeting could wait. Over the next hour, the conversation came in fragments. Not a confession, not a life story, just pieces dropped carefully like someone testing the weight of ice before stepping forward. Claire told him she was from Boston originally. She had moved to Chicago 4 years ago for a position at a financial consulting firm. She had been good at it. The kind of good that gets you promoted twice in 18 months, that earns you a corner office, and a reputation that opens doors before you walk through them. Nathan recognized the tone. It was the same voice people used when they talked about something that no longer existed. What happened next came out in a few spare sentences. The firm had gone through a merger, new leadership, new politics. Claire had flagged irregularities in a client account, numbers that didn't add up, transfers that had no paper trail. She had done what she thought was right, and the company had done what companies do when someone becomes inconvenient. They let her go. Not fired outright. Nothing that clean. They restructured her department, eliminated her position, and made sure that every reference call painted just enough doubt to close every door she tried to open afterward. Within 6 months, the career she had spent a decade building was gone. Within a year, so was everything else. The apartment, the savings, the version of herself she had always believed was unbreakable. Nathan listened without interrupting. He didn't offer solutions or reassurances because he knew from his own experience that those things were worthless when the ground was still moving. What he felt instead was something he hadn't expected recognition, not of her specific circumstances, but of a pattern he knew well. He knew what it looked like when a person's entire identity was built on a single structure: career, family, purpose, and that structure was removed. He had watched it happen to himself in slow motion during his divorce, when the life he thought he was building with his wife and his son had quietly disassembled itself while he was in the office closing deals. He hadn't ended up on a freezing street corner, but he had ended up in this apartment alone, and there were nights when the distance between those two outcomes felt thinner than he wanted to admit. He didn't say any of this to Claire. Not yet. But something shifted in the way he looked at her. She wasn't a charity case. She wasn't a risk to be managed. She was a person who had been operating at a high level and then had everything taken from her at once, and the fall had been steep enough that she hadn't found solid ground since. Nathan understood falling. He just happened to land in a penthouse instead of a parking lot. The next 2 days passed in an unspoken arrangement that neither of them named. Claire stayed. Not because Nathan asked her to, and not because she had nowhere else to go, though that was likely true, but because something about the apartment, the silence, the absence of pressure gave her room to breathe. Nathan went to the office during the day, and came home in the evening to find Claire in the same spot on the couch, sometimes reading one of the books from his shelf, sometimes just looking out the window at the lake. They ate dinner together, takeout mostly, since neither of them cooked, and talked about small things. The weather, the neighborhood, a documentary Nathan had half-watched the week before. They didn't talk about her past again, and Nathan didn't bring up his own. It was as if they had both agreed, without saying so, to exist in the present tense only. But the outside world didn't operate on the same terms. On the third morning, Nathan's phone rang during his morning meeting. It was his assistant, Laura, and her voice had the tight professional quality it always took on when something had gone sideways. Someone in the building had talked. A photo of Nathan walking through the lobby with a woman no one recognized had been sent to a local gossip site that covered Chicago's business elite. The headline wasn't published yet, but Laura had received a call from the editor asking for comment. "They're calling her a mystery woman," Laura said. "They want to know if it's a relationship." Nathan felt the muscles in his jaw tighten. "It's not a story," he said. "Kill it." Laura told him she would try, but her tone made it clear that trying and succeeding were not the same thing. That evening, Nathan came home and found Claire sitting on the couch with her shoes on. She had come across something online while connected to his Wi-Fi. She didn't say what exactly, but he could guess. "People are going to talk about this," she said, and her voice had gone flat again the way it had been on the first morning. "About you, about what this looks like." Nathan set his briefcase down and stood by the window. She was right, and they both knew it. A CEO brings a homeless woman into his penthouse, the narrative writes itself, and none of the versions are kind. Either he was being reckless, or he was being predatory, or he was having some kind of breakdown. There was no version where the public saw what had actually happened. Two people both damaged in their own way, sitting in a quiet apartment and trying to remember what it felt like to be human. Nathan spent that night in his study, staring at his laptop without seeing the screen. The board meeting was in 2 weeks, the Harkness acquisition. The biggest deal Caldwell Technologies had pursued in 3 years was in its final stage. Everything he had worked for was balanced on a wire, and one tabloid photo could send it swaying. He knew what the smart move was. Thank Claire, give her money, connect her with a social worker, and close the door. Clean, professional, defensible. That was what any advisor, any attorney, any rational person in his position would tell him to do. He opened a new browser tab and searched for transitional housing programs in the Chicago area. He found 7. He bookmarked none of them, because the truth, the one that sat in his chest like a stone he couldn't swallow, was that this apartment had felt more alive in the past 3 days than it had in the past 3 years. The sound of another person breathing in the next room, the sight of a second coffee cup in the sink, the small, ordinary evidence that he was not the only person in the world. Nathan had spent a decade building a company, and in the process, he had stripped away everything that wasn't the company. His marriage, his relationship with Ethan, his friendships, which had quietly downgraded to business contacts, and then to names in a phone he never called. He had told himself that success required sacrifice, and he had sacrificed until there was nothing left to give. And now a woman he had known for 72 hours was sitting on his couch, and the thought of her leaving terrified him more than any quarterly loss report ever had. Claire felt it too, not the connection, but the weight of it. She had spent the past year learning to need nothing from anyone, building a shell out of silence and self-sufficiency that had kept her upright when everything else gave way. Now that shell was cracking, and she didn't know whether to let it or to run before it shattered completely. She looked around the apartment, the expensive furniture, the view, the closet full of suits that cost more than she had earned in her last 6 months of work, and felt a familiar voice in the back of her head. The one that said she didn't belong here, that this was borrowed time, borrowed warmth, and that staying any longer would only make leaving harder. She had been someone once. She had earned her place. But that woman felt like a stranger now, and Claire didn't know how to introduce herself to someone she no longer recognized. She made her decision before the sun came up. On the fourth morning, Nathan woke to the sound of nothing. No footsteps, no creak of the couch, no quiet breathing from the living room. He walked out and found the apartment restored to its original stillness, every surface wiped clean of her presence. His overcoat, the one he had draped over her shoulders in the parking lot, was hanging on the back of a chair. The only sign that she had ever been there was a note on the kitchen counter, written on the back of a grocery receipt, in small, careful handwriting. It said, "Thank you. I'm sorry. You deserve better than this." Nathan stood in the kitchen holding the note, and the apartment closed around him like a fist. He had lived alone for 3 years and never once called it loneliness. He had called it independence, discipline, focus. He had filled the silence with work calls and market data and the low hum of a television he never watched. But now, standing in that kitchen with a receipt in his hand and an empty couch behind him, the word he had been avoiding landed with its full weight. Lonely. He was lonely. He had been lonely for years, and it had taken a woman freezing to death in a parking lot to make him see it. The cold that had driven Claire to his door wasn't just outside. It had been inside this apartment all along, and he had simply gotten used to the temperature. Nathan went to work that morning. He sat through his 9 o'clock call with the Harkness legal team. He reviewed the acquisition timeline with his CFO. He signed off on a marketing budget that had been sitting on his desk for a week. He did everything he was supposed to do, and none of it registered. His body was in the office on the 47th floor of the Caldwell Technologies building, but his mind was back in the kitchen holding a grocery receipt with 6 words written on it, in a handwriting he had only seen once. By noon, he had read the same email 4 times, without absorbing a single line. Laura knocked on his door to remind him about a lunch with a potential investor, and he told her to cancel it. She looked at him the way she looked at budget projections that didn't add up, concerned, but too professional to say so. He left the office at 2 in the afternoon, which was something Nathan Caldwell had not done in over a decade. Marcus brought the car around without being asked, and Nathan sat in the back seat for a long time before giving a destination. He wasn't sure where to go because he didn't know where Claire was. She had left no phone number, no address, no way to be found. All he had was a name and the memory of a woman from Boston who had once worked in financial consulting and had lost everything for doing the right thing. It wasn't much, but Nathan had built a career on finding answers with less. He called a private investigator he had used once during the divorce, a man named Tom Weber, who worked out of an office in Lincoln Park. Nathan gave him what he had Claire Monroe, originally from Boston, relocated to Chicago approximately 4 years ago, former financial consulting professional. Tom told him he would need a day, maybe 2. Nathan told him he needed it by tonight. Tom said he would make some calls. He had contacts at several shelters and transitional programs across the city, which was where he usually started when someone had recently fallen off the grid. Nathan hung up and asked Marcus to drive him home. The apartment was waiting for him exactly as empty as he had left it that morning. He spent the rest of the afternoon doing something he hadn't done in years, sitting still. Not working, not reading reports, not checking markets. Just sitting in the chair across from the couch where Claire had slept, looking at the space where she had been. He thought about Ethan, not about the custody schedule or the missed weekends, but about the last time he had actually held his son. It had been months. He could picture the boy's face, but the image was getting vaguer each time he reached for it, like a photograph left too long in the sun. He had told himself he was working for Ethan's future, but at some point, the future had become an excuse, and the work had become the only thing that was real. Tom Weber called at 8:17 that evening. Claire Monroe was staying at a women's transitional shelter on the west side, a place called Harbor House. She had checked in that morning. Tom explained that one of his contacts at a nonprofit intake network had matched the name. It was a small city, when you knew which databases to check. He offered to send the full background file, but Nathan said the address was enough. He wrote it on the back of a business card and put it in his coat pocket. Not the cashmere one that was still hanging on the chair, but a different one, a heavier one. He didn't go that night. He sat with the address in his pocket and thought about what he would say when he got there, and realized that every version sounded like something a CEO would say, polished, strategic, designed to produce a specific outcome. That wasn't what Claire needed. He knew that much. She had spent the last year being handled by systems and institutions and processes that treated her like a problem to be solved. He didn't want to be another system. He wanted to be a person standing in front of another person saying something honest. He went to Harbor House the next morning. It was a 2-story brick building on a quiet street, clean, but worn, with a small garden out front that had been put to bed for the winter. Nathan parked across the street and sat in the car for 10 minutes before getting out. A woman at the front desk asked who he was there to see, and when he gave Claire's name, she looked at his suit, his watch, his shoes, and then picked up a phone to call upstairs. 5 minutes later, Claire came down the stairs. She was wearing different clothes, donated most likely, and her hair was pulled back. She looked rested, more solid than she had that first night, but when she saw Nathan standing in the lobby, her expression didn't soften. It tightened, like a door being tested by wind. "You found me," she said. It wasn't a question. Nathan nodded. "I needed to talk to you." Claire crossed her arms, and the gesture was so familiar, the same protective stance she had taken on the couch that first morning, that something turned over in Nathan's chest. She looked like she was bracing for something. A pitch, an offer, a transaction dressed up as kindness. He had rehearsed half a dozen ways to start this conversation in the car, and he abandoned every one of them. "I'm not here to save you," he said. The words came out rougher than he intended, but they were true, and true was the only currency he had left. "I'm here because my apartment has been empty for 3 years, and I never noticed until you left." Claire didn't move. Her arms stayed crossed, her weight on her back foot, ready to turn and walk away. Nathan kept going. "I'm not asking you to come back. I'm not asking you to be anything. I'm asking if you'd let me help, not because you need it, but because I need to do something that matters. Something that isn't a deal, or a contract, or a quarterly report." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a business card, not his own, but one he had picked up that morning. It belonged to a woman named Sarah Hollis, the director of a workforce re-entry program that partnered with several firms in the financial district. "There's a position open," Nathan said. "Entry level. It's not where you were, but it's a door. I can get you an interview, and after that it's yours to earn or walk away from." Claire looked at the card in his hand for a long time. She didn't take it right away. Something was working behind her eyes, not suspicion exactly, but the careful arithmetic of someone who had learned the hard way that generosity usually came with terms. "Why?" she asked. Nathan could have given her a dozen reasons. Because she deserved better. Because the system had failed her. Because he had the resources, and it was the right thing to do. But those were the answers a CEO gives at a press conference, and this wasn't a press conference. "Because 4 nights ago you were freezing in a parking lot, and I was freezing in a penthouse," he said. "And I think we've both been cold long enough." Claire uncrossed her arms. She reached out and took the business card from his hand, and her fingers brushed his for less than a second. But it was enough. Enough to feel that the trembling was gone. She looked at the card, then at him, and something in her expression shifted. Not trust, not yet, but the beginning of a willingness to let trust be possible. "I'm not going to owe you," she said. Nathan shook his head. "I'm not keeping a ledger." She called Sarah Hollis that afternoon. The interview was scheduled for the following week. Nathan offered to arrange a temporary apartment through a corporate housing program his company used for relocating employees, and Claire accepted, but only after he agreed that she would pay rent once she was working, even if it was a fraction of the actual cost. He agreed because he understood that this was not about money. It was about standing on ground that belonged to her, not to someone else's charity. They didn't become a couple that week, or the week after, or the month after that. What they became was harder to define, and more honest than any label could hold. Nathan called her on Tuesday evenings, and they talked about ordinary things, her interview, his board, meeting the weather, turning slowly toward spring. Sometimes they met for coffee at a diner, halfway between her new apartment and his office. They sat across from each other and talked the way two people talk when they have already seen each other at their lowest and have nothing left to perform. It was slow, it was deliberate, and it was the warmest either of them had felt in years. Nathan flew to Connecticut that spring and spent a full weekend with Ethan. Not a scheduled visit, not a custody obligation, a choice. He took the boy to a baseball game and sat in the stands and watched his son eat a hot dog, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, he wasn't thinking about the office. He was just there, present in the most basic and most difficult sense of the word. When Ethan asked him why he was smiling, Nathan didn't have a good answer. He just said, "Because I'm here." The cashmere overcoat stayed on the back of the chair in Nathan's apartment for a long time. He didn't move it. He didn't send it to the dry cleaner. It just hung there, a $1,500 reminder that the most important thing he had ever done with his money was take it off his back and put it on someone else's. Kindness doesn't need to be loud. It doesn't need a strategy or a board's approval. Sometimes it just needs to happen. One coat, one cold night, one decision not to walk away. And sometimes that's enough to bring two people in from the cold.